For years, historians in Texas have heard about the Battle of Medina. We knew that it was the biggest battle. We knew that there were no other battles, Civil War or others, that were as big as this one. We knew it. But for some reason or other, we had never located it. We had some records, and we did have some good historians who did try to at least write about the battle and tell us about it. But for the most part, we still didn't know everything about the battle. And the one thing that we did not have for sure is where did it happen? We know where the Battle of Alamo was fought. It's a shrine. We have people all over the world coming here to the Alamo. But the biggest battle ever fought in Texas, we didn't know. For years, we have not known. I have known a couple of things. I know that we, for all this time, did not know where that battle was, and I know something else. That place is going to be a national park. When people start realizing, like we're starting to now, how important that battle was, it's going to grow, it's going to become more important, more recognized, and we're not just going to have a little plaque out there. That thing is going to be a national park. And we now have the best idea we've ever had. We now have somebody who has actually measured, because the generals had logistics officers. They left their records. And then, as you're going to hear today, there's a key crossroads that tells us exactly where the crossing point was, where that battle had to take place. I won't take any more of your time. Let me tell you that you'll be hearing from Robert Marshall, who is, who is a Texas Aggie. Let me say that he earned his degree in geology at Texas A&M College in 1959. He is a Texas Aggie, and he wears one of these rings. And as a Texas Aggie, he served in the United States Army. He worked as a petroleum geologist in Louisiana and Texas. He is an avocational historian and continues his research on the Battle of Medina. After all of these decades and decades of wandering, this gentleman has measured, and he's located, and he's going to tell you about how the battle happened, and ladies and gentlemen, where the battle happened. Robert Marshall.
Well, good afternoon. After that, I don't see anyone napping yet, but maybe it'll happen after that lunch. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for that kind and generous introduction. I only recently met Dr. Tijerina, but I was pleased to find out that not only is he a fellow former student, but he was a former leader of the Fighting Texas Aggie Band, which is quite an accomplishment. I'm standing here really by accident. I only happened on the Battle of Medina about 9 years ago. There may be a few of you in the audience that are as old as I am and remember we studied Texas history in the public schools from a Texas history comic book published by the Magnolia Petroleum Company. And that was about the full extent of my knowledge of Medina for over half a century, if you can believe that. But the Battle of Medina, I think most of you are somewhat familiar with it. It was the climactic event of the Gutierrez-McGee filibustering expedition or invasion of Texas in 1813. When a man by the name of Gutierrez de Lara, a Mexican from near the Rio Grande and a former compatriot of Father Hidalgo in that revolution, that failed revolution, he recruited about 300 American volunteers to join about 50 Republican Tejanos to try to overthrow the Royalist government, the colonial government in Texas, and they did invade. And they were initially very successful for the reason that most of the American volunteers carried what were called long rifles or Kentucky rifles. Those weapons were still muskets. They were loaded with a lead ball through the muzzle, but they had in the manufacture, they had to put a spiral inside the barrel, a spiraling groove. So as a result, the Americans came in with weaponry that was far superior to the Royalist weapons, which were basically smoothbore muskets. And as a result, the first 3 battles that were fought with the Royalists in Texas, the Royalists suffered about 10 times the casualties that the American volunteers or the Republicans suffered. So in the Battle of Medina, where the reverse just happened, the Americans were about over half of the army fighting the Royalists. They suffered tremendous casualties. Over 1,000 men were killed, whereas the Royalists only suffered about 55 killed. And we'll talk about that in a minute about why that occurred. But so that was really about all I remembered about the Battle of Medina, that it took place near the Medina River, and that's what showed on that comic book that we studied in Texas public school. And the reason that happened is time had passed, over 100 years had passed, and most history was passed down orally. And after a few generations, where else but would you think the Battle of Medina would be fought but near the Medina River? And by the time I started studying Texas history, that was the commonly assumed location of the battle. However, in 2009, I just happened to pick up a book which was titled Forgotten Battlefield, the Battle of Medina. I sat down and read it. It was based on the manuscript of a native of Atascosa County, Kenneth Swartz, and it was published 8 years after he died in 1985. The book is really a very interesting book, and I was amazed by the amount of information the man had pulled from archival records, and particularly was impressed with the fact that he had compelling evidence that the Battle of Medina did not take place near the Medina River, but took place about 10 miles south of the Medina River in connection with the Encinal de Medina, which was the oak forest of Medina, which starts about 4 miles south of the Medina River and continues for another 6 miles. When you travel to Interstate 37, after you leave Loop 1604, you'll cross over about 6 miles of low sandy hills, and that's what the Encinal de Medina was. However, in reading that book and using only the information that was in that book, just by logical deduction, I had the insight that the battle could not have taken place where the author speculated it had occurred. And with my curiosity aroused, and I'm a 6th generation Texan that has loved Texas history all of my life, or most of it, I decided I'd find the Medina battleground. So I set out on the task of doing that. This is the San Antonio de Bexar to Laredo portion of Stephen F. Austin's 1822 map of Texas. The red lines, the one that the one that goes straight south is the road to Laredo from San Antonio. And the other red line that branches off to the southwest is the El Camino Real, or the Lower Presidio Road that went from San Antonio de Bexar down to the Presidio on the Rio Grande. On that 1822 map of Texas, right there, Stephen F. Austin wrote the words, "Toledo defeated." General Toledo was a Cuban Spaniard who was the commander of the Republicans in the Battle of Medina. The other archival records establish that this was not a speculation by Stephen F. Austin based on hearsay, but was on first-hand knowledge. There is a letter that exists where Stephen F. Austin tells of taking his nephew to the Medina battleground and showing it to his nephew. So we know that this is first-hand information by Stephen F. Austin only 9 years after the Battle of Medina. This map was never referenced in the book Forgotten Battleground. I cannot explain why it was not, because both of those roads are well known, and the junction of those two roads is well established. This is a map I've put together that in order to understand the Battle of Medina, you need to understand the terrain south of San Antonio. The map basically starts on the north at South Loop 410 and continues down to the south to the Atascosa River in Atascosa County. You notice a green outlined area. It's about 6 miles wide. That's the Ensenal de Medina, which in 1813 was a wilderness, populated by bear, deer, cougar, turkey, no one living there. And it was a heavily forested area. They described where you could hardly ride a horse through the forest. So as a result, when an army is coming up from the south, as the Royalists did, they would have to travel through one of these three crossings of the Ensenal. The red lines are the approximate locations of the three roads that cross the Ensenal and could be approached by an army that's coming up from Laredo, which is where the Royalists were forming up. In addition to the main three roads, there is there's another road here, which later on General Arredondo, who was the Spaniard commanding the Royalist forces, he called that road the Camino Tapa, which translating into English is it's the road that connects, or the road which connects. And it was a way for anyone traveling the Laredo Road over here on the east to cross over and join onto the Lower Presidio Road if they wanted to. And then there was also a road to the west, which is essentially along Highway 16. Thank you. Which is essentially along Highway 16 today. The west road is about Highway 16. The eastern road there is essentially along the line of Interstate 37. And the central road, this part of it is no longer an active road, but from here north on into San Antonio is the Lower Presidio Road, or the Camino Real, which the DAR marked with granite markers back in 1918. And in 1915, the state of Texas commissioned a surveyor to survey the Lower Presidio Road, and he did so all the way from East Texas, Nacogdoches, down to the Rio Grande. And he surveyed it in detail with a very accurate in 1914. So this Yeah. This junction of this road and this road are well known. It's a well-known intersection and shows on many of the maps continuing on up into the 1870s. The situation here was that, first of all, the number of people were involved. There were about 600 American volunteers in the Republican Army of the North, and about 400 former Royalist soldiers who had joined up either after being captured or deserted from the Royalists. And then San Antonio de Bear had become very much a Republican town in support of Father Hidalgo. And so as a result, many of them joined, and actually the First Republic of Texas was formed by San Antonio Tejanos, who declared Texas independent from Spanish colonial control. The Republicans decided they didn't want to stay with their families in San Antonio and have a battle in San Antonio, so they decided to go south of San Antonio to confront a Royalist army which they knew was forming in Laredo. And by about a week before the Battle of Medina on August the 18th, 1813, the Republicans had sent scouts out and were following the Royalist progress just day by day. They were well informed of the progress that the Royalists were making. Some of the most important information we have about the Battle of Medina is a post-battle report by General Arredondo that he wrote to the Spanish Viceroy in Mexico City. And in his report, he describes where they were. I'm having trouble with this thing, obviously. He describes how they, on August the 16th, were 4 miles north of Rancherias. Well, Ken Swartz, who wrote the book Forgotten Battlefield, didn't know where this Rancherias was, but he speculated that Rancherias might be the headquarters of the ranch, Rancho Atascosa, which was the ranch of the Mission San Jose. And so based on that speculation, he concluded that the battle took place when they crossed over to try to get on this road, because in his report, General Arredondo said he had no knowledge whatsoever of where the Republicans were, and so he was trying to avoid them, trying to move in a different direction. Well, now, what was the insight that I had as to where the battlefield had to be? Let's go back to the author of Forgotten Battlefield. He had the Spanish Royalists at about this location on the day before the battle, on the morning before the battle. And it's in the archival record that on the afternoon before the battle, the Republican scouts came in and told General Toledo, who was the Republican leader, where the Royalists were camped. For 2 days, the Republicans had been at the Rodeo de Espada, which was the area of corrals and a water source, which was had something to do with the Espada ranching operation. And for 2 days, on the 16th and the 17th, they were at approximately this location. The next morning of the battle, General Toledo woke his troops up at 4 o'clock in the morning and marched them 2 miles south into the Encinal and formed up the troops across the road with big hills on both flanks with impassable woods there. So I would ask you this question. Where did the Battle of Medina have to take place? And you can have the same insight that I did. Some of you have probably already come to that conclusion, but remember, the Royalists, according to the author of Forgotten Battlefield, were here on the Western Road. Why would the Republicans, who know where they are, march 2 miles south to set up an ambush on the middle road? Ain't gonna happen. General Toledo would never have marched 2 miles south to set up an ambush on the middle road if he had known that his opponents were on the western road. He would have gone over here and set up here. That's the whole reason he was here for 2 days, is waiting to find out which road they were coming on. So that was the insight that I had, and to me it just is as clear as a bell that had the Royalists been on this road or on this road the night before the battle, there's no way in the world that General Toledo would have marched south into the middle road to set up an ambush, when we know that he knew where they were. His scouts had told him where they were, but it's not in the archival record as to where they were. The only thing in the archival record is that on the night before the battle, the Royalists had encamped 9 miles from the Republican encampment. That's the information that's in the archival record. But obviously the scouts didn't come in and say, General Toledo, they're 9 miles away, you guess where they are. He told them where they were. So that's why they set up the ambush. Well, at 5 o'clock in the morning, General Arredondo, who had an army of about 1,800 men, of which almost 1,200 were cavalry, sent 500 men north on north on the middle road to find out if they could find the Republicans. And he gave them the orders to not engage in any kind of serious combat with the Republicans, but to draw them back to the main Royalist army, which he said would be on the Camino Tapa. And that's this connecting road. And we go back to Stephen F. Austin's map. Stephen F. Austin had it on this Camino Tapa, just a short distance south of the connection, or the junction between those two roads. The Royalists sent out about 300 cavalry, and they did engage the Republicans in the ambush. The ambush was discovered, and there was some skirmishing and so forth, and the Republicans then charged thinking that was the main body, and they pursued the Royalist cavalry for for 4 miles through this heavily forested Encinal, which is just, some places the sand is, if you walk in it today, you'll get in ankle deep. They were trying to pull 7 of their cannons through that sand for 4 miles. It exhausted many of them. But nevertheless, they pursued them, and They pursued for 4 miles, and then it's the consensus of surviving Republicans that after pursuing for about 4 miles, they crossed a small creek. That's this little tributary of the Galenas Creek, which is here. And after crossing the creek and coming out of the heavily forested area, they came upon a line of temporary breastworks behind which there were 600 Royalist infantry. That temporary breastworks was probably a line of overturned supply carts and camp gear and various things that they had piled up. I visualize this being like John Wayne in Fort Apache trying to hold off the Indians. Turn those wagons over, get ready to fight. And that's what they had done. It took about an hour after the first contact before all the Republicans were able to get to the battlefield. And then they engaged for almost an hour, probably standing no more than 150 yards apart, because that was about the range of the even the rifle muskets that the Americans had. And the Royalists had a total of 9 cannons, probably 4 on one side and 5 on the other side on the flanks. Some of those cannons were 12-pounders, where the Republicans were only able to bring 2 3-pounder cannons to the battle. So there was a mismatch there as far as the cannon fire is concerned. In addition to that, if you can visualize an area of no more than probably 20 acres, 25 acres maybe, on which there are 11 cannons and 1,600 men firing black powder muskets. As a result, most of these men that were firing after a few minutes at 100-yard distance were not aiming at individuals, but shooting at muzzle flashes that they could see in the distance. But the Royalists, of course, had those cannons, and the evidence seems to indicate that the Royalists were really firing a lot of what would be called canister shot or grape shot. And you can just imagine what a cannon would do to a group of men that are standing out 100 yards away when you're firing like a shotgun pattern at them. So this had been going on for almost an hour, and in the previous battles, the Republican tactic had been to first silence the Royalist cannons, and they usually were able to do that with the rifle fire and so forth. But in this case, with the maybe it was that hot August day and not much wind, it soon just became a cloud that they were fighting in. And so as a result, it took almost an hour before they were able to silence all of the Royalist cannons. And when they did that, General Arredondo, who was behind his troops over here, ordered himself a fresh horse and told his aide to go forward and tell his troops to retreat, because he thought the battle had been lost. The Republican cannons are still firing, and all of his cannons have been silenced. And the Republicans, when that was silenced, I'm sure they started thinking, well, that we can go ahead and charge in like we've done before in these other 3 battles. So they began to advance. But about that time, a light wind came along and cleared the battlefield of the smoke. And the Republicans who were still fighting, probably no more than 250 of them were still fighting, because the records of General Arredondo, checking on the post-battle casualties and so forth, there were over 600 Republicans dead or dying at that point in the battle, and maybe only 200, 250 were still aggressive. And an aide to General Toledo said, at this point, there appeared a spectacle of two armies beginning to fly apart from each other, each thinking itself had been defeated. And that was because when these surviving Republicans could see what they were doing, here were 250 infantrymen standing amidst 600 of their dead and dying compatriots on the battlefield. And as in many battles, when there reaches a point in which one individual decides this mortal combat is no longer something I'm interested in continuing, one of them decides he's going to turn around and go the other way, and pretty soon it turned into a rout. The Republicans were all trying to save their lives, is what it amounted to. The Royalists began to go back to their breastworks and began firing their cannons and so forth and so on. And I think that, well, the record is that about 111 of the Republicans surrendered. It's not specifically described as to whether all of them were former Royalists or not, but there is a record in the archival record that some of them, if not all of them, were former Royalists. In fact, General Arredondo is said to have personally executed a San Jose mission Presidio corporal with his own saber. And they did execute all of those men who surrendered. One of the American volunteers who survived the battle said that although General Arredondo said he immediately sent his cavalry out to try to pursue the retreating Republicans, this one Republican says that was not the case, that they could hear cannon fire from the battleground for almost an hour after the battle was over. And so there was a delay, and anyone who was well enough or so slightly injured that they could catch a horse and get away did. But as you can imagine, most of these Republicans were killed by cannon fire. There was one American volunteer who survived and later came back to Texas and died in Texas in 1830. He was hit by 7 grape shot from a cannon and survived it. So, but as you can imagine, many of those men who were hit by 7 or more grape shot were seriously wounded or killed. And there was a slaughter subsequently of the seriously wounded Republicans who were trying to flee along the road back toward Bear. The record is that bones and skulls of rebel dead could be seen for 2.5 miles north of the battleground for years after the battle. In fact, the best estimate is that about 1,000 Republicans out of 1,400 were killed. Let's see what's next. And the result was that the after-battle report was that the Royalists only lost 55 men killed, and in all probability, I believe that those probably were infantrymen who were servicing the cannons on both sides of those breastworks because they were more exposed to the rifle fire from the Republicans. And then, let's see, most of the Republicans that managed to get back to San Antonio very quickly moved on toward Nacogdoches, hoping that they could come up with some more men and rally, but they did not. And it was really a tough battle, a slaughter really of Tejanos but not of the Americans. Apparently most of the Americans who survived the battle, some of them were captured in San Antonio but were later released. When I located the Medina battleground from the archival record, and I published in 2 articles in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly and the January and July issues of the 2017 Quarterly. There's no doubt that the battleground is located between Bruce Road, it's a stride, Old Pleasanton Road, which is this road, which is the successor to the Camino Tapa, and Bruce Road, which is a little county road here, and the railroad overpass, which is just off the map to the right, going over the railroad, right over here. This is the battleground. And this is a satellite photo that I obtained after locating the battleground. And can you see a visual anomaly there? This satellite photo was from a period in which there had not been a lot of rainfall, and there was very little vegetation in this area. And that's the anomaly that we're looking at. As an experienced geologist and familiar with the geology of this area, I immediately suspected that this was the location of the burial ground of the Republicans. 9 years after the battle, in 1822, the new Mexican Texas governor, Tres Palacios, was coming up from Mexico to take over as governor of Texas, and with his escort, they collected all of the bones of the Republicans that had been laying on the battlefield for 9 years. And they buried them near a big oak tree on the battleground. To me, unquestionably, they picked a central spot where the skeletons were laying, or the bones were laying, and buried them in that central location. So, and as a geologist, I can say without fear of contradiction that this area, which subsequent investigation shows to be an area that's heavily cemented with calcium, cannot be a normal geological, it cannot result from any normal geological processes having to do with any of these outcrops in the area, but is exactly what you would expect after burying about a ton of bones in the sandy subsoil of this area. Yeah, it's okay. Okay. With contributions and donations from both individual and corporate members of the Texas State Historical Association, Friends of the Medina Battleground erected a 1-ton, 5.5 by 3.5 foot Texas pink granite monument on the battleground just west of Old Pleasanton Road prior to the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Medina. The Medina battleground should be designated as a National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service. And you'll also find when you visit the battleground that we've marked the combatant battle lines with some wooden mock-ups of circa 1813 cannons. Well, I guess the only thing to do now is to thank the Witte for this opportunity to give the Medina battleground some of the public recognition it deserves. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, and congratulations. We have a few comments now on another aspect of the battle. As Robert said, the Spanish general Arredondo ordered that the bodies not be buried, and they lay there for 9 years on the battlefield, over 1,000 bodies. Some of them escaped into San Antonio, into Béjar, 100 or so men. They were caught and they were executed here on the plaza. A very few of them escaped and ran all the way through Austin, all the way up to Nacogdoches. They were caught and executed there. But the question is, what of the families? So we have a person to talk to us a little bit about the women and the families. Dr. Amy Porter, an associate professor of history at Texas A&M University, San Antonio, got her PhD at Southern Methodist University in 2004. Her book, her award-winning book, is Their Lives, Their Wills, Women in the Borderlands, 1750 to 1846. Dr. Porter is a distinguished historian in Texas. She's done seminal research on the women in Texas. She's going to be talking to us about that. I might want to mention also that she is a colleague and a co-author of mine. She and I and a couple of others are writing the first ever textbook. It's a textbook on the history of Mexican Americans in Texas that we're going to submit to the State Board of Education. Now, this is not something that we just put together. These are 5 scholars of her caliber that are spending months and months and months of research and peer review to put it together. Dr. Porter's contribution is critical in that textbook, and she's here to talk to us about the women and families and the Battle of Medina. Dr. Porter.
Wow, thank you. What a nice introduction. So I'm just going to take a few minutes here to, I have some slides, but I'm not going to go through too many of them. I want to make just a few big points. I'm going to jump forward here. Some of these points are obvious, but I'm going to state them anyways, and then I'll get into just a little bit more detail. So one, the slides I just flew through. When we talk about battles and war, there are always women there. When we look at the armies, there's often families traveling with those armies. One of the examples where we see this really quickly is 2 months before the Battle of Medina, the Battle of Alazan. There are families with the Spanish royalist troops. Ignacio Elizondo is camped southwest of San Antonio. There are families, largely from Nuevo Santander. And when the Republican Army of the North comes out of San Antonio and attacks early in the morning, reportedly, the families, the soldiers are at mass, and there are women and children casualties. And this shouldn't surprise us. I mean, this is common when we look at military history. If we look at the Battle of Medina, more specifically, we heard about the devastation, how many men were killed. This is one of those obvious points, but I'm still going to make it. There are a large number of women who are widowed. There are a large number of children who lose fathers. The psychological impact of that, I think, is incomprehensible. And the economic impact of that is very real as well. And then what we see more directly right after the Battle of Medina are widows who are brought to La Quinta and imprisoned. La Quinta is in a house downtown, and maybe as many as 300 widows are kept there. And they are treated quite horribly by the Spanish royalist soldiers. They're forced to grind corn, make tortillas. Reportedly, if workers were too slow, they would be whipped or beaten. And then there's also stories that indicate sexual assault. We heard these stories before. If we follow General Joaquin de Arredondo earlier, when he was in Nuevo Santander, similar stories of sexual assaults by soldiers against women. and he is letting them happen, not stopping them, and we see this repeated, possibly elsewhere. When we see this, sexual assaults against these women or other type of improprieties, there's a message being sent here. This is punishment, right, for those who participated, who rebelled against the Spanish government, or those who didn't stop it. But there's further implications, right? This is about families, men who, well, they're gone in this case. They're not able to protect their wives. These families are dishonored, right, as a result of what's happening to them here. So those are a few of the implications. Let me, La Quinta again, when some of the women are brought back from East Texas, those who were fleeing, they were imprisoned in La Quinta, so the story sort of repeats itself. Property confiscations. As a result of the Battle of Medina, we're going to see Arredondo ordering property taken away from rebels, and some women lose property. And if you were in my talk earlier, I was talking about the importance of community property. So presumably some of the property, even taken from the men, there's not careful studies of this, right? When the property's taken, it could have been some community property. But the economic implications of this for families will be tremendous here. And then there's going to be policy orders that Arredondo gives that will have tremendous implications for families in the area for really almost the next decade. So Arredondo is going to order that people at outlying farms and ranches come back in closer to San Antonio. At one point that they turn in weapons. He's trying to stop rebellion, make sure there's no more rebellion out there. So you're going to have less food production. You're going to see increased Indian raids, loss of livestock. And these food shortages are real. People are complaining about them. In the Bear archives, there's mentions of trying to get more grain into the San Antonio area and medical supplies because of shortages. So this suffering is quite tremendous and goes on for quite a long period of time. So in many ways, let's turn that off. The implications of the Battle of Medina for women and children, they're very long-term, and they speak to the psychological trauma of living through something so devastating, and then the real suffering that comes from the hardship and deprivation of food, of very real things, and then also the loss of manpower. And then in many ways, when we get to Mexican independence, it's a reprieve in many ways. And one of the ways we see this ended is what Andres was talking about just before I came up here to speak, the burying of the bodies, right, that had been ordered, left out there. So in many ways, it's an ending. And then if we move forward in time, we're going to see upheavals again in some of these same families involved in fights for Texas independence. So I'm not going to say much more than that because I want to make sure we have time for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. Okay, questions. Christine, did you all have a mic or something for the questions? Right here in the middle, sir. And if you'll speak, and she's bringing you the mic so that we can all hear your question.
I've always been curious about the population that was in San Antonio prior to the Battle of the Medina and the population after the Battle of the Medina. Are San Antonio are in basically the state of Texas?
I can take it unless you want to, Amy. What, do you have figures? I would just throw out the figures, 4,000 before, 2,000 afterwards. What I've always said is that George Washington's army in the American Revolution, he lost about half his army. But the Tejanos lost half of the entire population. Native American Indians were not counted in that census that I'm giving you. George, can you help us with that?
Well, the problem is the Indians in the missions started continuously dying off with smallpox. And so you had these mission populations, which would be Native Americans, and then you had the mestizos, and then you had the, you know, Spanish. And so it's kind of a moving target, unfortunately. But I have a
Do you have a question?
I have a comment for the location of the Battle of Medina, and I don't know if the speaker's aware of it, but there's 3 very good pieces of documentation about specifically where the battleground was. And one of them, the best one, is Lieutenant Sanchez writes a diary when he comes with Jean-Louis Berlandier and General Terrain in 1828, 1830, and they go past the battlefield. They all 3 write diaries, and Jean-Louis Berlandier makes a series of very beautiful, detailed route maps. But Lieutenant Sanchez gives a description in his diary of crossing each creek. And as he crosses various rivers and creeks, he comes upon the battle site. And they mention that the bones have been buried at this tree and all. But he says it's a certain distance from Pera Creek. He gives the leagues, and then how far it is to the Medina. So he gives from one creek to the site, and from the site to the Medina. And then the Berlandier's map is extremely detailed. But the other one is Seth Eastman, a U.S. Army officer, did a series of sketch maps around San Antonio in 1848. And he shows where the rancherias, the ranch site is on a map south of San Antonio in 1848. I don't know if you've seen those.
Yes, I would like to answer that question. You're really talking about generalizations that modern, the most recent archival records just amplify. The first map that I showed on the screen really is the critical one, which was the map of Stephen F. Austin showing where the battle took place. And then if you will refer to my 2 articles in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly in 2017, I think you'll find that there's just overwhelming redundant evidence in the archival record. And I didn't mention that not only is the unique signature of the battleground been found by that calcium anomaly in the middle of the battleground, which is where the battle dead were buried, but also the landowners have found dozens and dozens of musket balls and cannon grape shot and over 6 Republican cannonballs, and we found some additional artifacts subsequent to that. There's no doubt whatsoever as to the location of the Medina battleground.
Yes, sir. Someone over here. Yes, sir.
Really, I think the answer to that question is that San Antonio was so sparsely populated, so many died in the battle or were exiled into Louisiana to escape the harsh conditions that the Royalists imposed. And then, just 20 years later, there's the Texas Revolution, battle for Texas independence, and then 10 years later, there's the Mexican-American War, and about 20 years later, there's a Civil War. So much happened in the generation after this battle, and the other explanation is the Battle of Medina was lost as far as most of our culture is concerned. It was a reversion back to the Royalist Spanish control, and also the illiteracy of the age is also a factor. I think, like most people had come, by the time I studied Texas history, it was just commonly known that the Battle of Medina took place near the Medina River. And I attribute that to you remember the childhood game where you sit in a circle and you whisper in somebody's ear and it goes around the circle and you get an entirely different story by the time it comes around. Well, what's more logical for the Battle of Medina than for it to have been fought near the Medina River? And I think that's just really the way it came about. And so many other things more important, bigger, took place than this in the next generation, that it just got overwhelmed. But I would like to mention one thing that I do believe is the most significant consequence of the Battle of Medina. Santa Anna was an 18-year-old officer in the Royalist Army in the Battle of Medina. In his experience, 600 Mexicans behind temporary breastworks slaughtered 600 North Americanos. He had utter contempt for North Americanos. And as a result, on April the 21st, 1836, knowing for over 24 hours that there were 900 Texans camped within a mile, Santa Anna and most of his army took a nap. And there's Texas independence.
Thank you, Robert. I agree with that response. Béjar, San Antonio was in turmoil. Many of the families simply fled the city. And the bigger names, Navarro and the other big families, had to flee because there were like arrest warrants for them. They lost their lands, so they ran out to their ranches where they stayed for the next few years. Finally, let me say, at the Bancroft Library in California, there is an anonymously written account in great detail, presumably by one of the women who was held in La Quinta, that is several pages long, that details the treatment that they underwent and the results after the battle. So we do have that one document written by a person. It is anonymous. It is at the Bancroft. Yes, ma'am.
Years ago, my husband and I, who do genealogy, were helping a friend, and she had a broadside signed by Arredondo on December 31st of 1813. A broadside is sort of an award, and he was a Mexican soldier. And it got to wondering what length of time Arredondo was in San Antonio. Now, I hear that he was here before, of course, the Battle of the Medina, but then I don't know how long he stayed here. But if he signed a broadside here in San Antonio in December, it means to me that he was here that length of time, and possibly even several months later when he went back to Mexico City, I think in March. So that puts him here a lot longer than 4 months, which is the general feeling that he was here. But what really strikes me is if Santa Anna was a young person, a young soldier, and he was here with him, was he here as long as Arredondo was here? And that would make him here over 6 months. And we don't know anything about that. And has anybody ever found out? Was he really here? He was here, but we don't know how long he was here. And there was quite a bit of familiarity on his part as to the area and the people and so forth and so on. The thing is, he also came, when they came through the same places where they had the Battle of Alazan in 1813. That's where they came from, in that direction. So has there been anything to let us know how long that Santa Ana was actually in San Antonio in records or anything?
I don't have anything. Arredondo did write a full account. He does mention Santa Ana, but he does not mention how long he was here. Amy?
Yeah, no, I don't know either specifically about Santa Ana. I haven't even thought about that before. It's a good question, though. I imagine there's a chance we could probably find that out. But I mentioned this before in my other talk. There is a new biography out about Arredondo, and I read it a few months ago, but he might have a little bit more information there. I don't know if anybody recalls. Yeah. Do you know, Frank, did he say how long Santa Ana stayed? He's here through the end of the year. Through the end of the year? Okay, there we go.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was going to add earlier about the Ezekiel's at the battle. Bellinger describes that area as Rancheria. Rancheria was used by the Spanish to describe an area where numerous tribes made. So it was easy for the Lapan, who occupied all the way from Espada to Medina, and which part of that force is to blend in and disappear following the battle when they saw the battle was going the wrong way. The thing about being in San Antonio is an occupied town by the royalists, and you could not speak of the people that they had died. You cannot talk about independence. You had to watch what you said, because your neighbors would be more likely to drop a dime on you. You go before Ariando, the women in the La Quinta could hear the men digging their own graves, and then hear the shots where they were, dropped into the grave. So it was a very, very stressful time in San Antonio. It was an occupied city, and it stayed that way for about the end of the year. And then the Spanish refused to protect San Antonio. So the Mapanapaches, the Comanches, all these people had a good time coming in and disrupting the town. It wasn't until after people began, and this is the beginning of the Tejano frontier force, where they gathered together Tejano Rogers and became basically Texas Rangers. So that's one of the reasons why there was such a disruption in San Antonio.
Thank you very much.